Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the Czech Benoni, one of the more common ways that you'll see the Benoni played. It starts out with d4, and that f6, c4, and then after c5, white pushes forward with d5 here. And there's three main lines that you'll see black play here. The first one is going to be the Benko gambit, which is how I like to play, and that is b5. Then you have the modern Benoni, which is e6. And then you have the Czech Benoni, which is what we're going to be covering today, and that is e5. Now, it is more sound than the other openings, both the modern and the Benko gambit, very aggressive lines. This is not that at all. It tends to be a very closed game, so you'll see some positions later on where looking for some long, middle, and end game. So if you're one of those players that you like those very long games where not a lot of material is trading off early on, this definitely could be the defense for you. We're going to be looking at a few variations. One is going to be if they decide to take here. So en passant, if you're not familiar with this move, the first time a player plays their pawn up 2 squares, if there's another pawn right next to it, they have one move and one move only to capture like this. So this is a legal move for white. So we'll be going over that. The other one is if they play e4, which looks like it's undefended, so the knight can easily take it. It's not, so we're going to look at what that looks like. Then we're also going to be looking at both the knights coming here to f3, and then the main line, which is what most players are going to run into, and that is knight to c3. Hopefully you guys enjoy the video. So the first line is going to be en passant with white taking here on e6. You're really not going to see it too often, but I just want to make sure everyone is prepared if you do come across this. You're going to recapture with your f-pawn. Generally in chess, you want to capture towards the center of the board, always trying to control the center. There are a few cases where you may not want to. We'll do another video on when you may not want to capture towards the center, but in this case, you absolutely do want to capture towards the center of the board. But then where do they actually continue from here? Maybe knight to f3, getting a minor piece developed into the center of the board. Black, pretty much every move is going to be pushing here with a d5. Has both the pawn, the queen, and the knight all protecting the square right here. So depending on where they go, if they capture here, black recaptures. Black has center control right here. Can get both of his bishops involved into the game. His knight here on c6, very easy. If he doesn't capture here, may want to get his knight involved into the game, but then black pushes forward here to d4. This is a pretty awkward setup. Now the white knight has to move here, and then eventually you could get the queen here to a5. Just not really the setup that white's looking for. So again, really not going to see white taking that pawn early on with en passant, but just want to let people know what you could see if it did happen in the game. Now the next variation you could see is e4, because it looks like that black can just take here on e4, and while it's not necessarily a trap, you're not going to get that free pawn, but I still think you need to take it. If you don't take it, you're not going to have nearly as good a setup as you probably think you would. So I'd recommend just go ahead and taking this on e4, but be prepared for the move queen to e2. Now, if they don't play queen to e2, then they truly did just give up this pawn here on e4. But this is going to get the material back, because once this knight moves, this knight's under attack here, this pawn here on e5 is going to fall. Now, the knight could come back right away. It could come to f6 or d6. I prefer d6. But it could also hold on to this material for at least a short amount of time, and that move would be f5. And the reason I like this is because it forces white's hand a little bit. If we just bring our knight back here to d6, then they're going to play queen takes on e5. We play queen e7. They can exchange if they want to, but they still have a pretty good setup right here. If instead we play pawn to f5, we essentially are forcing them to play something like f3. And this is now forcing the knight to move away, which they will get that material back. So after knight to d6, yes, they can come down, take here on e5, and we can play queen to e7. But the difference now is this pawn on f3, much weaker setup for white. It both weakens the king side of the board and also weakens the square, the natural progression for where this knight would want to come to on f3. So this is definitely what I prefer. And this is pinning down the queen. So white has some options here. Usually not just going to take, because Now black can just recapture, castle on the king side of the board, has a lot more minor pieces developed in the game. So you could see something like f4 that says, yeah, if you want to capture my queen, I'll recapture. This is a great setup for white. It has center control, attacking the knight here. Now the knight is forced to move, can't come here to c4 because that is defended by the bishop here on f1. So black's probably not going to recapture. What I recommend in this position is knight to e4. The main reason is it looked like the knight was actually defending this square here on f5. And as soon as it comes up to e4, this looks like an outpost, but it's also leaving this pawn here on f5 undefended. But it actually is defended because after the queen takes, if it takes, I mean, that would be a huge mistake, you could play knight to g3. This is a discovered attack on the king, and it's also attacking the queen here on f5. The queen is going to fall, white's going to fall, black is definitely going to win the game. So yes, early on, I would recommend taking with your knights here on e4, but just recognize that you're not going to be able to hold on to that pawn as soon as they play queen to e2. The next variation that you could see is knight to f3, and you have two options here. If you're playing the Czech Benoni, generally you are playing a longer game. You're looking for a clog center of the board, and so you're probably going to be playing something like d6 because this is what you do in the Czech Benoni, and we'll go over that in the main line here in a second. So after knight to c3, you play bishop to e7, pawn to e4, you castle on the king side, and this is kind of the main setup that you're used to seeing if you're playing the Czech Benoni. But I recommend, just because I like to take aggressive lines in most openings that I play here, instead of d6, I recommend pushing forward with e4. And this is just common practice to start pushing your pawns forward up the board. Hey, they have a pawn on the 5th rank as white, pushing up so you have a pawn on the 4th rank as black, forcing the knight to move. Now, the knight doesn't have a lot of great options. They're usually going to come back to d2. And this is where it gets a little tricky, and you're definitely going to need to play this quite a few times to recognize that this is not necessarily a bad move. But if on the face of it you look at it and say, I don't know if I like that position, then just go ahead and play the d6, because you are going to give up material in this line, and that is playing e3. And they may look at this and just recapture. And yes, that is absolutely what we are recommending here, because then black's going to continue with their game plan. But look at the game board and how white continues. Yes, they're up a pawn in material, but both of these pawns right here are blocking the light square bishop. They don't have good king side safety because their f-pawn's gone. It's going to take some time before they could even develop enough to get to king side safety if they want to castle on the king side. They can't move this pawn here, so they're going to be pushing maybe g3. But now it looks really awkward if they castle on the king side. They're not going to be castling on the queen side anytime soon. It's going to be difficult to hold on to both of these pawns. Later on, black has a lot of opportunity to start to attack these pawns. So black gave up a little material right away for a much stronger position right away. And then later on, much stronger attacking line. So bishop to g7 potentially, bishop to g2, d6, opening up for the light square bishop to get involved into the game. Once you start playing this more, I think you'll recognize that black has a lot of good options. But if we come back and say, yeah, I just don't want to give up that pawn, then you probably don't want to be playing e4. Instead, just go ahead and play that d6. And that brings us to the main line, which is what you're going to see most of the time, and that is knight to c3. You're going to respond with d6. They're generally going to respond with e4, and then bishop to e7. And then bishop to d3. And a lot of players, when they think about the Czech Benoni, this is the specific setup that they are looking at. And there's a lot of things to keep in mind from both sides of the board. Black has a pretty cramped position here. White's really far up the board here. You can see both these pawns in the center are equal here, but white is much further up the board than black. You know, this pawn here on d6 is cramping a lot of the squares that black can go. The dark square bishop's not going anywhere for a while. The light square bishop can get outside the pawn chain and start doing some stuff, but black's really going to be looking at some point to start pushing up these pawns on the flanks. But at the same time that black's looking to do that, white can also be looking to attack on the flanks as well here on the F file and the B file. Now, if both sides aren't looking to do that, they may also start to attack with their other material and see how they can maneuver in different ways. So black may be looking to bring his knight to a6 and then eventually to c7, and then at some point attacking here on b5, or if he wants to push his pawn forward, he can do that as well. Sometimes if we see the knight coming here to a6, you could see white start to attack on the queen side of the board, and you start to have a race. Sometimes you'll even see that black will push his pawn up here to a7, and then white will respond with a4, just wants to stop the threat of the pawn coming up here to b5, and then all of a sudden you have this critical square here on b4 that's a great outpost that black can get to, and it's then very difficult for white to actually attack this square right here. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and part of the way that I like to approach this from black is a waiting game and not committing to one specific variation and kind of waiting to see what your opponent's going to do. And so the first move that I like to play from here is just castling on the king side. Some players will automatically commit. They'll play knight here to a6, but I like to go ahead and castle on the king side. And to give you an example of why that would be, let's say that white immediately starts to attack on the king side and plays f4. Okay, well, black captures here, the bishop recaptures, and then black decides, yeah, I want to go ahead and get my knight here to d7. The main reason is you want to bring your knight here to e5. This is a great outpost. You can start to attack this light square bishop right here. It's very difficult for white to really do much. And then let's say they played knight to f3. Then you could even play knight to g4. And then both of your knights are both aimed at the square here on e5, and you can easily control that. Now, that's very different than if you were to come back a few moves, and if they play instead of castling on the king side, if you play knight a6, now all of a sudden they play f4, you take, they recapture, and then you kind of sit here and wonder, okay, well, I'd castle on the king side, that's the same, but then they play knight to f3, and they've already started to attack the king side of the board. Maybe too late to start to attack on the queen side. So I feel like castling a little earlier, even though it's one move, gives you more options as far as how you want to continue. Now, let's say they don't play f4, because that could be pretty aggressive early on. Instead, after bishop to d3, castle on the king side, maybe they played knight to f3. At this point, they haven't attacked on the king side. Maybe at this point you want to play knight to a6 and start to attack on the queen side. So you definitely have some options. If they play something bishop to g5, just know this is a huge mistake, because you can just take material here on d5. This is a free pawn. If they take your bishop, you're going to recapture with your knight here. You're up a pawn. If they say, yeah, I'll just go ahead and take your knight, okay, well, you take their bishop and you're up a pawn here. So that's going to be a mistake. Sometimes players don't recognize that they can't just pin down your knight to bishops when they have some pawns in the center of the board. It doesn't always work like they want to, especially in the Czech Benoni when they have this pawn here on d5. So keep that in mind. If they try something else, castle on the king side and then a3, from here you have a lot of different options. I would say rook here to e8. You don't have to commit to anything right away. You don't know, because they could play a3 and then start to push forward here on f4. So I would continue normal game plan. Get your rooks center of the board. You can get your light square bishop board if you want to. Eventually, you can start to push on the queen side. So you definitely have some options. But really, black needs to make sure that you're attacking on the wings at some point. You don't want to have such a cramped position that you don't have any fighting chance. You don't want to play this just for a draw. You have some strong attacks, but you are going to have to attack on either the king side or the queen side at some point. But you can tell from these positions, no material has come off the board. It's going to be a much longer middle and end game. So if you like these positions, if you're looking at this and you say, I could definitely maneuver around here, this is my type of game, then the Czech Benoni could definitely be for you. Thanks so much for watching the video. If you like the video, if you wouldn't mind, please click on the like button. It definitely helps the channel. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe. If If you have other videos you'd like me to make, you can always leave a comment, or the best way to contact me is through email, thechesswebsite@gmail.com, or there is a chat functionality on the website. You can always chat me. I try to respond as often as I can. Thanks again for watching the video. I'll see you guys in the next one.